Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Bycer, and we have another interesting cast lined up tonight. My guest is a game developer who went into the tabletop space and has been working on and helped design various tabletop adaptations of popular video games, including Shovel Knight, Dead Cells, Rivals of Aether, and other projects. And he is on tonight to kind of talk about his work, background, as well as the challenge of doing this kind of translation from digital to tabletop. So please welcome from Solis Game Studio, Chris Solis. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you on. For those of you listening, Chris was introduced to me by fan of the site as well as frequent podcast guest John Brieger, and he's also in the tabletop space, and we have spoken many times on that topic for sure.
Yeah, John and I work very closely together with his development studio. I guess I'll talk a little bit about what I do in tabletop now, and then I'll go backwards. I do more of the assembly production, finding the right team to create the product. And then John does more like the mission, usability of it. And there are also projects we do together. So yeah, we kind of have this this crossing of products here. And between us, we have like a ridiculous. I think that's also what led keys and larger licenses.
And for those of you listening, we did do a podcast with John. This was about a year, maybe 2 years ago, where we talked about kind of the challenges of working with licensed IPs and making tabletop or board game adaptations. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about that when we get further into the cast with some of the games that you've worked on. So, to get things started with, Chris, since this is your first time on the cast, for the people listening to us, can you talk a little bit about your background in the game dev space?
Yeah, well, this is my first time on. I got into the video game industry in about 2009. I started working at 2K Games for user research studies. I got to work on Spec Ops: The Line and Duke Nukem Forever around the games around that time, 2010. And then I got really into usability, which is kind of, I love that, like people's experience and at different levels, especially at different skill levels and at different demographics. Then eventually I was like, I kind of want to make a game. I want to make a tabletop game. And then I discovered the world of tabletop, realized how untapped. So I kind of wanted to bring these game design studies to this new space. And that's kind of how this happened, right? So, you know, always growing up with games and loving video games, being able to get a tabletop and then work with video game, something that brings people out of happiness.
And yeah, like talking about like your time at 2K in there, I remember like Spec Ops: The Line, one of my favorite games. I would love to talk to developers about that title. It must have been just a fascinating game to design.
Oh man, yeah. So they had us on those moments, and so we would get like we would get a pool of people and create various pods of people to come in and play the section of the game. And it was my job to make sure that they felt the emotional impact. And then we would write about it and tell the developers if the players felt like they were making like a real decision or impacted or not. Then they would tweak it, and then we would get a new build of that part of the game. So that was the part we measured. Like even though we had them go through more about that. And that's just how people were like, oh, I feel bad about it, even if it was a non-actual decision game, you know? And I mean, that's why people like that game now. So it's quite an honor to focus in on that.
Yeah. And again, like there's an entire conversation, I think, around Spec Ops that we could certainly get into. But to bring back to like what you've been doing, so as we've said, you've been working with tabletop adaptations. What was kind of like your first like tabletop game you worked on?
Yeah, so when I first got into tabletop games, I did start off as, hey, I want to make a game as a hobby. And I just kind of made a game that I wanted to make called Terrain Odyssey. It's like a battle card game about JRPG. So imagine like a JRPG where you have your 4 characters, like a Final Fantasy X in that kind of battle system. But what if I could fight another adventuring RPG team with those battle system, right? So I made a card game based on that idea. Created a little universe, created a game, made some cards. And I self-published that like out of my garage just for and that eventually led me to making more tabletop games that I realized I loved doing it, and I started discovering it more professional. Even though that itself isn't a video game license, it's already inspired. You know, I wanted to get that choosing your team, setting them up for comparing them in a turn-based game that's already natively turned into a video game. So the influence started young with the video game.
Great. And one thing that I like to ask developers, especially those who go into the tabletop space, because of my audience, I think primarily consists of digital developers.
Hmm.
And one thing I'm always curious about is, like, when you first started getting into the tabletop, what was kind of like, I guess, like, the most challenging or like the most unique thing you had to kind of like wrap your head around going from working with digital games to a tabletop experience.
I don't know if wrapping my head around is the right way that I felt about it. To
Hmm.
me, it was easier,
Hmm.
and it's because I'm not a coder.
Hmm.
I can't get into Game Maker and start creating that. However, when I was younger as a hobby, I loved to talk about game systems, ideas, and experiences. I was already creating that part for fun that eventually became a profession to do in life. So when it's like, hey, I want to make a board game, it was just that raw. Yeah, I have to
Hmm.
think about tabletop as a platform and what I can actually do with these apps. But I didn't have this coding barrier. I could just create an experience, and that was freeing for me. And that's definitely the reason I did it for fun at first. I really wanted to make a game. I really wanted to get something out there. So yeah, I don't know. Honestly, it felt way easier.
Hmm.
Um, that being said, I did grow up with card games. I was in fourth grade, got into that Pokemon card game, and then Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh. So I've always played card games. But not exactly tabletop, the thicker experiences. But yeah, I understood the analog platform.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think, like for me, for fans listening, then they know that I didn't really grow up with a tabletop background, and it really wasn't until like maybe like the last 3-4 years ago when friends kind of like dragged me into like tabletop simulator board games that I really
Mm-hmm.
got a chance to kind of see just how far like the tabletop industry has evolved and grown over the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's changed massively. And the complexity of those games has increased. Also, the user. There are
Hmm.
some games in 2010 that were really popular that really caught my attention as unique, non-classic American game experience.
Hmm.
Yeah, we had Monopoly. I'm sure you heard of Settlers of Catan. I think that was
Yep.
one of the first ones to really get out. Seven Wonder, or Arkham Horror, or Dominion. These board games sold millions of copies. And maybe 10 years from now, they might be on that list. Sorry, Monopoly. It's getting there. And those games really did something different. And they had the challenge of getting a new mechanic into the consciousness of every, so then they can build their game. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
That's board games' biggest challenge. So imagine you're young and you're playing your first shooter ever, right? You have a tutorial. It will teach you how to play. Um, there are experiences that are shooters that can ease you into the idea of knowing what a shooter is. So then later you can play. You might play other shooters that are more complex that don't need, and other games that build on it, like Borderlands, that mix shooters and like RPGs. You understand it natively because you know what both those,
Hmm.
right? Board games, well, I mean, not until recently, I think it's developing, basically doesn't have that way, right? But we're getting there. Eventually, I can probably tell the average gamer, oh yeah, this is a, and they get just like those genres, and they can understand. And then I can tell you about the game I actually want you to play on top of it. So because board games don't have these tutorials, they're in a way a little harder to get into because they're front loaded. John and I tackle that all the time.
Yep.
How can we make our games as usable as possible? We add tutorial experiences to it. It's like, yeah, open this booklet and play this level. It just kind of eases you into it. So then you can discover it in that fashion. But you wouldn't if you learn more about it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, I spoke with John definitely about that topic of onboarding and approachability many times. And we have spoken about user testing a lot on these design casts. And it is a very interesting and multifaceted topic. I mean, I don't think we'll ever run out things we can, say enough about making sure the onboarding of a game, whether it's digital or tabletop, is on point. And like you just said there, like the tabletop market sounds very similar to what we see in grand strategy or 4X games. That
Mhm.
they each have their own unique language to them.
Mhm.
And for the fans who get into them, they can mostly, translate, what they do in one game to another, or at least at the basic level. But if you're coming from the outside, you're trying to learn, Total War or Solaris, good luck with that. Trying to do that on your own.
Yeah, exactly. That's already like a several nested experience. I'm not going to be like, yeah, I'm going to just
Yeah.
have to be built on.
Hmm.
understanding your audience too. There's nothing wrong with making that total, right?
Yep.
What is your game's audience? Where am I aiming at, and how can I make that? Sometimes we discover that a game might feel like a toy, but it could easily be way more accessible by cleaning up the way the game is just presented and the way maybe merge a few systems and almost not change the experience. John and I come across this all the time in tabletop, right? Designers get ahead of themselves, just merge some things down. Like, well, now more people can play your game and understand it. And that is what we do.
Yeah. And I did a podcast, I think it was like maybe 3 weeks ago, maybe about a month or so ago, with Sandy Peterson of Peterson Games. And yeah, we had a whole conversation about trying to, or not only just trying to, but just the growth of the tabletop market in the last 10 years, especially with the rise of Kickstarter. And like, this is one thing I think a lot of digital only developers seem to kind of still are mystified about, that Kickstarter for tabletop games is huge. And it really has like given like this market a major shot in the arm in the last 10 years.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot to say there, but for me, the number one thing that goes underlooked is devs. There are a lot of board games that are almost done or can't be made in a year and delivered. I'm not saying there aren't games that don't whiff, right? But a video game development is so much.
Oh yes,
and so much less likely to fulfill that. Like, there's no trust. You know what I mean? I think that's why video games haven't gotten on this train as well. But board games have the right length and the right density, and I guess in a way the right proofing. Like, you can easily see this card is done.
Yes,
this board is done, right? When for a video game, it's gonna be a while before you get to it.
Yeah.
So, and that's why board games are killing it. I mean, have you backed a board game on video game on Kickstarter? You actually
I've backed a few, and I have gotten them, but I know I have heard, I'm sure you have as well as the audience listening, many horror stories of Kickstarter projects that just don't work. And what you said there about kind of getting the vertical slice or the proof of concept is a very big point. With a tabletop game, take out a piece of paper, fold some things, write a little board down, write some notes, and you can show somebody what you have in mind. You can't necessarily do that, or at least not really show somebody that, with a video game. And of course, we're excluding talking about the whole coding side of things, and development scope, and just even project management. And it is tough. And again, like, my audience, they are probably nodding their heads right now as we're talking about this. It is very risky to try and sell a video game, especially if you are a first-timer. And I guess here's a little question for you. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at this yourself, but for like first-time or kind of starting out tabletop developers, is Kickstarter, or does it seem like Kickstarter is still viable for them as much as it is for kind of the established vets?
Yes, and mainly because I've done it. I can tell you because I've done it twice. So let me just go through the history of that. That should clarify it. The first time I did it in 2014, my Kickstarter was, like, again, I just did it for fun, right? But let's make $25K, right? And I was stunned, and it worked. The amount of effort I put into that Kickstarter would fail today. It's definitely elevated. That being said, if you take it professionally and you put in the right amount of effort, do it again. So after I left, I did Level 99. I used to work for a tabletop game company called Level 99 Games. And just this January, I left, officially started this time with a different branding, a little different scope. But point being is that I have to start over again, a new brand, mailing list zero, new product. And, doing the Kickstarter again, and it went great, but you got to work way harder. You got to really think of it as a company now. That's 100% change. But if you're willing to have that professionalism and take it seriously, you can do it.
And as you said, kind of like that bar being risen in terms of the level of quality and professionalism people expect. That was another kind of big nail in the coffin for a lot of video game Kickstarters. And I see this a lot, that I see developers go on the Kickstarter and the game uses like very rough graphics, lots of placeholder art, and there's like nothing really there. I mean, you can write 5,000 to 10,000 words about what you want in a game. It's a different story if the person can't see that in the video, or they can't try a demo. And and it just takes so much work to get into it. And fortunately, I have seen Kickstarter video game projects that have succeeded, but when those games succeed, it almost seems like they almost have their entire game or the majority of their game done already, and they're going to Kickstarter to get, like the final push, as opposed to saying, I have just an idea, give me $200,000 and I'll make it.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that is still true.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just write in like people want to see. Not that
Yep.
you can't change it, but you need to prove you can make it. And more importantly, you need to improve whatever your core mechanic, experience, or feedback loop exists.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just easier to do with it.
Yep.
That's bare minimum. But I think that it's the same problem at a different scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
Making a video game's going to cost way more time and more money. And then what if you, that's a waste of a year, right? And it's just painful. So you got to think of it that way. Proof of concept, words aren't going to translate to the way those mechanics feel exactly. Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do?
Yep. You're going to have to either put in the work and get something, mostly there, or, you got to get really, really lucky. And it is definitely very hard out there. But like we said a few minutes ago, I guess to somewhat end this topic on a positive note, it has been mostly positive for the tabletop industry. Again, when I was talking with Sandy, I think another guest maybe like a few weeks ago, we were looking at like the most successful Kickstarter tabletop games. And like those games just, hit out of the park times a million in terms of the success they had.
Yeah. Yeah, they just blow it out of the water. Right? Like there's Gloomhaven, right? Gloomhaven had their expansion recently. It was like $10+ million. I think it was nearly 30. Insane, right? Mm-hmm. So, and before that, they had the regular Gloomhaven box, which also was. Before that, they had their first Kickstarter, which made a lot of money, but wasn't exactly a blowout. Like that game came out, ran its print run. People loved the game. Then the community was ready to go in, the one that put it on the map.
Yep.
Right? So even in that case, it's not like, hey, I had a game, check it out. That game was done, proofed, and played before it truly blew up.
Yep.
Like they still needed to do that, And if the game was not good, and that first Kickstarter did well, it would be written off as like, hey, that was a good Kickstarter, mediocre game. It wouldn't be what it is today. Just again, you have to prove your game. You just do. So you almost have to finish it. But I guess that's the difference. It's with a board game, at the very least, even if I finished my board game completely, I don't have to spend money to print it if it's not going to be a big, right? Mm-hmm. For a video game, all those costs are way before that. So that's also a huge problem, right?
Yeah. And I think another thing that, as you were just saying there, about kind of having like the first game come out and then the second one blowing up, like another thing that we've seen from Kickstarter and just like in game development as well is just how important it is to establish yourself and prove yourself in the eyes of the consumer. Because again, we have seen in like all spaces when it comes to game development, people who have good ideas who unfortunately can't take it beyond that proof of concept. And when you fail like that, people remember. And, growing a fan base, growing a community of people who want to support you, that is, that's another 5 podcasts in of itself.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
So,
I mean...
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no.
I was going to say, one day I would love to make a video. But I'm not going to transition to have the appropriate for exactly,
Yeah.
Like, I need to be willing to risk like 90% of the product, a budget now, have it not ruin me, and have enough clout to know. That is a huge amount. Like, that is not, I'm going to make a video game, like indie kid story. Like, that's a business.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah, that's just, it's a little sad. I want more indie games to come out. But, I have seen it happen. And even though it has changed, I'm sure that when those kids made their first indie game in 2012, that real product, they probably felt exactly the same way. So you got to follow your passion.
Yep.
Like we're working with Rivals for Pocket Pack, my next. And Dan, he made the game slowly rise. It didn't have years.
Yep.
So, yeah, the indie stories is a rough road.
Everyone is chasing, that one dream game that's going to put them on the map. But the reality, and I think what a lot of people don't want to comprehend, is that for the people who kind of survive and thrive in the indie space, it's about many games. And usually one of them is not going to be that $1 million hit, but it's going to be that one that's just enough to get you the notoriety and recognition to help move you up in that space.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to contribute to that by saying I think it's many experiences, which is almost always going back to Rivals. This guy has one core game and small spin-offs, right? But his game has consistent experiences, not just by adding stuff to the game, tournaments and events in public spaces, get people to realize his IP and then experience it, right? So, but it all funnels back to his main game, and it was always been about that. But he had supporting fun. As an indie game developer, that might be a bunch of indie games. But they can be interconnected, and that's what I'm trying to.
So I think with that, let's talk a little bit more about your work in the space of translating digital to tabletop, and then we'll see kind of where the conversation goes after that. As we said at the start, you worked on several projects. You've done, in terms of video game to tabletop, you've done Blaze Blue, Shovel Knight, Dead Cells, Robot Named Fight. You're currently working on Rivals of Aether. And
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
So let me talk. Yeah, let me start talking about those. Just take a step back to put those on a platform. I used to work after I made my my garage indie game, I got hired by a company called Ray, and they make a lot of dueling games. They're popular. Eventually, I became a producer on a system called Exceed. And Exceed is basically a 2D fighter system for tabletop. Then over time, we started bringing IPs into the system. So Dead Cells, Exceed, Blaze Blue, and a Robot Named Fight are all IPs that I worked on to bring into the system and then adapt those worlds to be in this fighting game. The challenge there was two things. I'm making basically a 2D fighter on tabletop, and these characters, design, kit, and feel needs to feel like the original source material, but also still be. Yeah. So that was my primary job with those IPs. I'll move on to it. But so how does the Beheaded from? So I love that cast. So play through the game and think about what feelings and feedback loops bring me happiness in that game as playing as that character. And I like doing things like, hey, I got scrolls. So use the different weapons in different unique situations. And then I think about the feel of the moves, just strictly art perspective. Like when he does the stab with like the staff and his arms all straight, like that feels good because it's a powerful pose. I think about those elements. Then I would get those elements and make my first draft of this character in the Exceed fight. Now, this part is the interesting part because the first layer has to be to function in this environment and have its own idea. And we mix them up and we try different drafts and whatnot. The Beheaded and Exceed, it does exactly that. He used scrolls. We went through all his game art. Motion Twin let us create art for their game, and we matched the style of the poster art. They approved it. They loved it. To mix these two ideas, like we need the Beheaded to do this, and we think the Beheaded will act in this way, right? So there's also some personification there to really think about the character and study the character and think about there's no animations, they're poses, right? To marry it all together. So yeah, working on Exceed and marrying those ideas is a lot of fun. You have a question there? There's way more to say there for now.
Yeah, I guess like the first thing is you were saying about trying to capture the feel of the gameplay in tabletop space. I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that, mainly from the idea of taking something that, again, like we talk about paper prototyping a lot with designers and just general game dev. But what we're talking about is taking a game that is played obviously from an action perspective. It's not built around, turn by turn, move by move kind of play. And how do you start breaking that down into an experience that you play on play with a tabletop and you're taking turns and you're moving around like that?
It's not system for system.
Okay.
I start strictly with feel. Then I think about what system, because I don't have control moving these other systems, these existing game systems on a tabletop. If I do something like that, I might get contemplated. I can make a tabletop engine to play like Street Fighter thing, right? And it would match things like, oh yeah, I shoot this fireball, do 2 spaces every turn, and like copy system for system. But that's just not fun, right? It's more of a simulation, and it feels like a planning document for a video game. That might be fun to me, actually. It does sound like fun to me, but it's not going to be fun for a consumer, right? When a consumer picks up a game like, what are their initial experiences? I mean, you have to really not think about like things like the pro play. What does Street Fighter feel like as an IP, and what systems do immediately? Those are the ones I want to translate probably into a new system. But at the end of the day, players will be like, oh, it kind of feels like, because it reminds them of what we did for Rivals. This is, I think, the easiest example of this. This other game we're called Pocket. Pocket Paragons is like a 3-minute quick dueling game, right? And in this quick dueling game, characters have the ability to one-shot each other, and it's really about dancing around, not getting one-shotted, and playing out the game, right? So we got other IP to it, and that's an IP that I worked on Level 99 Games, right? To make our shorter form accessible dueling game. Then we worked with Dan to get Rivals. Okay, so how can we get Rivals and put it into this system? A system where you have 7 cards to create a character's identity, right? So the first thing I think about is what's the main feeling of Rivals? And for those who don't know, Rivals of Ether is a platform fighter. It's kind of like Smash, right? But it's extremely movement. It's more about moving out of the way. You can move very quickly, agilely. Okay, there's no block in that game, right? You can just only parry, right? That kind of stuff, right? Right? Hyper movement. Well, we don't have movement in our card game. So how do we get that? And the way we're doing that is our Rivals characters, for one, don't have a block, right? You just can't block. Instead, they have another ability, more like a zoning kind of movement option. Like if you get the hardest read, this cool thing will happen and you will stay safe, effectively acting as a block, right? We could have just made it a block, but I think players are going to realize, like, hey, I dodged that situation by doing something smart, get hit. That's a feeling I get. So that's the first step. That's the core mechanic of the game. The game already said, I don't like blocking. I don't think it has, right? So I'm going to get that feeling and put it in this game. All right, how do we honor that? No blocking. Let's do something proactive, right? So that was the first step. And then we would think about the characters' kits, like on paper, right? Like, oh, this guy's a zoner. This guy shoots a boomerang to create more movement options, and do the same thing for their very specific mechanics and put them in these cards, right? How does it feel? Well, the time it gets to the paper side and we have the feeling, then we'll actually like balance, get usable. And I think the result is usually people are like, hey, that feels like that character. It's not a system.
It's more about, as you said, like the feel of what it's like to play the game, but translating the feel, not so much the mechanics, to the tabletop.
Yeah, because the mechanics have to change.
Yeah.
You can do your best to mirror them, kind of, but you get the feeling, you nail the feeling, you create a similar system. Don't copy and paste the system. Board games don't have the bandwidth for the video games, which we're used to kind of happening in the background, you know?
Yep. I remember, I think, one of the tabletop games my friends showed me was, I think it was the Doom tabletop game. And for those of you who are listening to this right now, you know that I've played a lot of Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. And playing the tabletop game, it definitely was not like playing those games for very obvious reasons. But as you said, like you could as you were watching or as you're playing the game, you can tell, okay, the shotgun does all this damage. We throw, this amount of dice for the shotgun versus, using a pistol. And it does seem like there's a little bit more psychology involved when it comes to kind of the tabletop space with getting that experience right. Because, like you said, you don't have the same affordances in digital. You don't have, the AI who can handle all the behind-the-scenes stuff. You don't have a graphics engine to render it all.
Yeah, so you got to capture the feel and do something different within your tabletop engine. Like the amount of bandwidth you use to play a tabletop game. Let me take a step back. Like you require a certain amount of bandwidth to just play it because you have to run all the systems. Right? So don't put fun into those systems. Think about the systems that go on top of it, and make sure that the systems you use to play the game aren't too complicated. Like our effects in Pocket Paragons, some of them are pretty well. That's already done. Like you already know how to play the game. So when you read this ability and your mind is jogging and how you can use it in a unique way, that's where I want you thinking. I don't want you thinking about how does my turn work.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to happen here and there. Putting effects in the right areas is critical. Again, going back to thinking, if you copy systems one for one, you're kind of putting it in both those zones. And I don't agree.
Now, here's a question I'm just curious about, like from like a market or consumer standpoint, like the games that you've worked on, Robot Named Fight, Dead Cells, and so on. in terms of the video game side of things, these games are aimed at kind of like moderate to expert players, especially something like Dead Cells, which that game gets very difficult when you're trying to go like the boss cell route. When you translate this to the tabletop space, are your games, I guess what kind of crowd are your games aimed at? Like in terms of like a novice, somebody who knows what they're doing, the hardcore super fan, etc.
Yeah. Okay. So, like those characters in Exceed is definitely like a moderate tabletop game, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is the kind of gamer that is used to the heavier stuff. They're willing to set up a board. They're willing to play for 30-minute hour, and are capable of internalizing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you have these roguelikes. Like there's an overlap there. Like the bandwidth for a roguelike and a game like Exceed is probably so. They're probably the same gamers probably enjoying. So it really boils down to: do you like tabletop games, and do you like these IP? If so, you're probably right. As opposed to Pocket Paragons, which is definitely more on the accessible. Like that game system is designed to get non-table to play this card, and they'll do so. That might govern what we put in there. The characters there are more bright and right. So that's kind of how we marry those experiences. It's not like we wouldn't get the way he presents it is critical. Like Rivals, even though that's like a hardcore platform, right? Like it's the characters are fun. Yeah, you'll be willing to pick.
And as you said, with trying to like aim the games at like specific audiences, I guess is there any difference in terms of like the design process between saying I want to design this game for casual first time tabletop fans versus again the more moderate already established fans?
Oh, totally. I think about that from the game engine perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, what kind of audience is Pocket Parent? What kind of audience? How much bandwidth is this? And make sure I hit. That's a system. I think that once you have a solid system for a target audience, the complexity you put into the effects and the cards, you kind of can't peak that. Like even if I made like a super complicated character and a simple, the system is going to ultimately govern how complicated that character can be anyway. So I'm not going to make a decision like, oh, this character is too much. I'm not going to put him in. I'll probably make that character, see how the system governs their complexity and the nature of my available option. And if there's a character that's too complicated for the audience, but like the top 2% enjoy within that audience, that's a win. You still need to make content. So.
Yeah. Another question that I have for you, kind of, I guess this would be more on like the logistics or planning side of things. Like, as we said, you've worked with IPs in terms of translating them to the tabletop space. When you get access to these IPs, do they give you any kind of limitations or constraints in terms of, I guess, how you design the tabletop for these games?
We get restraints on things like presentation, art, font, mainly. In terms of the gameplay, no, not really. That has not. At least with what they want to see their characters' kits translate. And we present that like, hey, this character plays this for this reason. They'll read that, but I don't think their approvals team is playing the game, and they're more concerned. Even then, they're more concerned about the card name. When we worked with Motion Twin, the art approval process was long, right? Make sure you get it right. That's the wrong hex of red, stuff like that. Also with Yacht Club, they let us make for level 99. They let level 9 unique art of every character like 7 times. Like every card has unique same character different poses, and we also did the approvals and proportions and whatnot. And card names. They're like, no, that name would never work in our lore, so use this instead because they're concerned about the universe.
Yep.
And they didn't ask if make sure his fire was this strong. That's never happened.
And I know when I spoke with John, we had a discussion about working with IPs like that. It really comes down to just how important that branding is for everybody involved. Because if you screw up on the branding, then it looks bad on, the original IP because they're the ones who gave you the blessing to do this. So they're going to be, looking over every inch of it to make sure that this represents their product the best way.
100%. Yeah, it's critical. Imagine if in a university made an IP product that didn't feel like the IP. Like, do you want to feel like a IP? You don't feel like the real deal.
Oh, yes.
So Yeah, it's really about. I'm pretty sure that if you made a game that critically off, that the company would. But I think that if you generally hit the feel and put that into game design, that they're not exactly right. You know, they're more concerned about.
Yeah. And I guess as kind of a managerial question for you, when you worked like with Level 77, I think that's what you said the studio was called. Level 99, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Level 99. With like getting the IP itself, is it a case of the IP holder reaching out to Level 99 saying, we want you to make a game, based on our universe? Or is it Level 99 reaching out and saying, hey, we make tabletop games, we would like to make one based on your game?
Yeah, they definitely don't reach out. It could happen, but I don't think so. And I don't think it's not because like they're per se looking, but they don't know. Like just imagine like they might not have any eyes on it or see it as a supporting product at all. The first thing they're going to think about is why not make some t-shirts and hats or plushies, the easy stuff, right? They're going to see a tabletop game more than likely, make something that fits that, make something that doesn't suck. That's what the IP, right? And if you fulfill that and make a good game, then that part is great for you. When we got, so they had Shovel Knight before I worked, so I'm not exactly sure how IP, but Dead Cells and the Robot Named Fight and BlazBlue, I had a larger part in it. I would be going to conventions with my coworker, a friend Crows, and we would just go to their booths and like chat about it, right? And then we make our pitch. Hey, we make tabletop, have a collab. And just 1 year at PAX East, we met the Twin Studio team, communicated what we do, followed up, and just got the license. Like we just walked up and got it, right? Because we presented ourselves professionally, we made it clear what we do, and we showed standards as a company. This is how we work. This is why it's a good idea, and then that worked out. And also, that's also they're a smaller team approach work, right? Something like BlazBlue, do a little more research. My coworker Jackie, she's really good at finding out who's the lead of marketing. Are we at the same con as them? Finding that person, setting up a meeting with that person. We do a pit, and we'd see them again at another con next month. Do more of a it's gonna take a couple months to warm them up. We would go to a licensing expo in Las Vegas to people, and even if a deal wasn't sealed, we presented ourselves. So if the idea ever comes up that they need a tabletop game, I know a tabletop company, Level 99 Games, their P's. We market ourselves there. That ultimately led to Arxis agreeing to let Level 99 Games work with BlazBlue, a Japanese company. So it's like if we weren't at the shows and we weren't communicating actively and being very proactive and being courteous and professional, there's just 0% chance that would happen. I think the deal closed at Evo, right? So when we met at Evo, we had a booth at Evo. We met with Arxis to a meeting, talked about them, and we showed them some mock-ups we made. This is what we can do. Proof of concept. We're talking about the Kickstarter thing. We basically have to do the game. Same is true for Getting That, apparently. Right? Here's our mock-ups. We can do this. We can do this thing. They agreed, and months later, this product now. It was a journey. You have to be present. You have to be social. They will not reach out to you, and you need to prove that.
And like we said earlier in this cast, building your recognition is huge in this industry. And I know the same thing for a lot of the podcast interviews I do, that people look you up for obvious reasons. You don't want to be on somebody's show. You have no idea who they are. Or you don't know somebody who's been on there because you don't know what that person's going to say or what they're going to do.
Yeah, totally.
Now, with kind of, again, like going back to the feel and getting that right, I guess my next question is, how do you iterate on something like that? Like, again, like for digital games, we go to play testing. We can look at, how this game feels in the player's hands. We can see how these mechanics work. But when you're talking about from a tabletop space, and you don't necessarily, again, as we said, you don't have that same one-to-one interaction, how do you, I guess, know that you're on the right track with your tabletop adaptations?
I guess we'll focus test it in two ways. We will have people play the character and on, perspective. We will ask them how they feel, and if they have it, whether they agree or not. Like, how does it? It might be better if I play them. Like, oh, this guy makes me feel powerful for these reasons. All those reasons the same, We ask questions like that and see if it aligns. It also includes your weakness, to be clear. Like, oh, this character is kind of a bad jumper. So how can we get that feeling of bad move. Like, man, I feel like I always get hit by attacks. I'm not sure why. That might be a linking. Like, I just made that up. My point is like, those are two feelings that might overlap. Me ask questions about how a character versus how they feel. It is a lot of feel. Some of it is unscientific. We do our best, right? but with enough information, we can feel more confident that this character is what it should be. I'm sure they have a similar thing. Smash, right? Like, how do you make this character feel? How do you make Little Mac feel like a true different system, right? Yeah. And they do it by making him consistently an underdog. That's a flavor, right? They make it so he can come at kids.
Yeah,
right?
and
they make it so you can be surprised at any given time. That's why he has super armor and random moves. Like, it's to be weak. Right?
Exactly.
And that way, that's why when you get destroyed because your jumps are terrible, that you're like, man, Little Mac is kind of weak. Everyone's going to think that at first until he gets that cable punch. And that's when it feels like.
Yep. Yeah. And I was just about to bring up the whole jumping point, too, as well. Like, they explicitly design him not to be good in the air because he's a boxer. He's not supposed to be jumping around, doing air dashing and easy air combos. And just as, like, Donkey Kong, there's while Donkey Kong was originally in the first Smash, there was never a Donkey Kong action game or beat 'em up. So they had to design the feel so you get that idea of the character while adhering to this brand new system.
Exactly. Yeah. No one said Donkey Kong doesn't feel like Donkey Kong, right? Because he's slow and strong and he can carry you. That's his critical thing. He's going to carry you off, right? So, yeah, exactly. Those are feelings, right? It's not the same, but it feels the same. So, I don't think it's any too different than tabletop.
Yep, definitely. So, with that said, let me do a quick time check. We are about like 5-6 minutes to the hour. Okay. I think we can still go, a little bit longer. But I guess any other aspects about kind of doing these adaptations that we haven't touched on yet that you would like to bring up?
I'm trying to think. I know there's more, but it's hard to come up with the questions sometimes. Like, let me think. I talked about getting them. I talked about feel, making the license holder happy. Getting out there is, I guess, one thing I say is like, I make sure to play whatever game I get. Like, okay, let me stay from the top. If I get a license, I will consume that property completely, right? I don't want to see it from a high level. I think that play that game, understand how it makes the player feel. Not in the first hour, but the 10th and the 20th. And then that really helps me, So, I'm going to make sure I get it right. What the player feels is different than what just an observer. It's just for the players. That's the feeling you need. So, make sure you understand the property clearly when you think it is a 1 hour review.
So, I guess here's an interesting question for you. When you're analyzing these games to be taken to tabletop, if you run into, let's say, any issues or pain points or any criticisms of the game itself, do you try and translate the entire experience into the tabletop? Or do you take certain liberties on that front, maybe to try and make things a little bit more smoother or make the experience a little bit more palatable for the consumer playing it?
That depends on the game. Like, I think for like Exceed or Pocket Paragons, I would admit a lot because but if I had to make a minis or something like P, for system, we need to see if it really depends on how married that mechanic is to what that IP feels like. It's hard to say without a specific example, but possibly. But I'm never going to prioritize one for one. It has to translate. And if I think it's bogging down the game, not the intended experience, then I will cut or try to find a way to maybe nod to.
Okay. So I guess one thing that we didn't touch on, we could probably go over very quickly. In terms of, I guess, the development cycle of these games, like, how long do you normally spend taking one of these games, I guess, from idea to finished tabletop game?
Okay, so idea for translating the IP or idea for the games?
Let's say you've gotten the IP already, and it's time to actually, make this tabletop game.
That could take 6 months to 2 years.
Okay.
If the system didn't exist, like, at all. If they said something like, "Hey, here's an IP. Can you make me a minis game?" That's a massive project, right? Most of the time, it happens the other way around. We have a system. We need a skin. I think this fits, right? We already did the Pocket Paragons and Exceed both existed before these IPs and had their vanilla sets, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we definitely have done it the way around. We're like, hey, we need a game that's this IP. Can you design one? So we can. So in that case, get that. We'll get the feelings of those games. We'll make a draft of maybe 3 to 4 different game systems at a higher level.
Mm-hmm.
Share with them, which of these do you like? What kind of experience do you like? Talk a little bit about marketing. What's the audience that you are trying to accomplish?
Mm-hmm.
And with that, pick a game system and then go from there. It would probably be a stronger IP game in that, quite honestly. Actually, no, I take that back. I'm not sure. Just the marketing team of IPs sometimes has a lot more power than you would like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That might become, please make me an Uno version of my IP or a minis game intended. But whatever system and restrictions they give you, you need to marry those as best as you possible.
And I guess keeping with that line of thought, I guess one thing would be more of a general question with regards to marketing and selling the tabletop games. Like, do you do a lot in terms of like physical stores? Now, obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so things have obviously changed in the last 5-6 months. But traditionally, do you work with like game stores, or do you do most of your orders and sales like just online?
So Level 99 Games definitely does. When I went on my own for Solis Game Studio, pandemic has definitely affected this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is definitely both. But you're getting so much more money at online, right? You kind of want to keep it, right? But you want your brand recognition. Stores these days get so many games that it's overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure they're significantly more likely a huge edge to have an IP,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you definitely want to do both, but you kind of need to finesse it a little. If you have to make a choice, keep your orders on,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But it's really like any other product. Like it's not like you're going to limit.
Yep.
I would say conventions are huge. When people go to conventions to do things, and board games really shine. Like, okay, we played our demos. You want to sit down and do something? Board game? People will sit down and play your game just they want and then love it and buy it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think board games specifically hit that market.
Yep. And I guess I have one other question. We talk about licensing. We talk about marketing them. Then I lost my train of thought there. I guess while I'm trying to think of this, anything else like that comes to your mind in terms of making these digital or these tabletop adaptations?
I don't have anything new to add. It really boils down to respecting the feel, and I think that's going to guide you down. You want to mix that with the best usability you can, and think about the audience and what this board game is for, and if his audience gonna like that,
Yeah.
Right. It's a general question. It is definitely a feel kind of art thing. Yeah, that's where it stems.
Okay. And I just remember what I wanted to ask you. For starting out prospective tabletop developers listening to this cast, I guess, are there any sites, cons, anything like useful information out there that you would suggest they would start to look at when they're coming with their first tabletop game or, branching out into this market?
Yeah, there's a lot of design conventions
Mm-hmm.
specifically for come and play your prototype at home. We'll play it and give you all kinds of feedback. You'll get it from players and designers. I'm in the Bay Area. There's a couple. There were a couple in the Bay Area. After COVID, they'll be back. They also have these things called protospiels at larger conventions, PAX or Gen Con. It's a room where you go there and it's all day. Sometimes they have pitch sessions where you can go and maybe they'll pick up your system and do something. These communities are way bigger than you. There's people there all the time, and it's a really fun thing. So if you wanted to create a board game in general or a board game for a P, you could just do that. People will. I wouldn't get married to the idea exactly because I'm journey, right? But make a board game based on an IP you love. You should do that. That sounds like fun.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for people listening, now you said at the beginning of this cast that you kind of translate it into the tabletop space relatively easily, like growing up liking those games. Are there any like first timer traps or things to avoid when you're starting out working on your first tabletop game?
I think it's a mentality thing. Your first prototype, which you will love deeply, will be bad. I'm sorry, right? It will have too many systems in it. It will be convoluted, and it's. I think a lot of people they go to these things, they might get a little right. But if you're open about it and understand that systems might just marry down into simpler systems and still feel that way, if you're open to that, you can this process. A lot of people get okay, that's fine. I don't want 3 hours in Street Fighter. You know?
Yeah. So I think with that, to kind of begin to wrap up this cast with, let's talk a little bit about what you're currently doing, what you're currently working on. So as we said at the start, you are currently developing the tabletop game based off Rivals of Aether. And I guess anything you can talk more about that or like share with the audience.
Yeah, so this is our in-house battle card game system, Pocket Paragons. Pocket Paragons has 4 sets that are going to go on Kickstarter in October.
Okay.
Rivals is one of the sets. So we have a base game, 2 tabletop game IP, and a video game. And the idea is quick dueling game, collect more characters, all cross-compatible. There's a convention spin on it. You can go to different pin on that. And the idea is since it's a growing system next year, there'll be more IPs. So it is a massive crossover. You can go and characters and do dreams. It's designed to be accessible to anyone. That doesn't mean shallow. It is fighting game like, but it is very simple. So we want people that don't normally play tabletop games to enjoy this game, and that's the kind of bandwidth when the system first came out. You can play it literally anywhere. It's called Pocket Paragons because you can play it while standing in a line. You know. Mm-hmm. We're pretty excited about it. We got some early reviews. People are really liking it, especially the fighting game community, which makes me happy because they realize that's the overlap I'm talking about, right? So, all right. So yeah, Pocket Paragons is my next big thing.
And as you just said, you're planning on doing a Kickstarter for this October. So ideally, for those of you listening to this cast right now, this should be going up right around the same time of that. And I just thought of one other question I wanted to ask you about the design before I forget. And that is, I guess, the length of a play. Because this is another big thing that's different, very big different consideration from a tabletop to a digital game. Now, the games that we've talked about already, Shovel Knight, Dead Cells, or even just like comparing like Dead Cells or Royal Name Fight to Shovel Knight. Shovel Knight is I think it's like a 5 to 10 hour long campaign, and Dead Cells and Royal Name Fight are usually an hour to an hour and a half runs. When you're designing the adaptation, how are you thinking about, I guess, the length of an individual play compared to the digital versions, or do you consider that when you're coming up with the game design?
Yeah, the game length is for the most part not dictated by IP.
Okay,
it's more of a game system thing. Like, hey, we have this. Like in the case of Exceed, it's a 30-minute game, right? Mm-hmm. We got those characters and put them into this 30-minute experience. If we were going to make a miniatures game of an IP to really make it feel like the video game from the ground up, it inherently is going to be like an hour or two out of the nature of having to be turn-based and set up and analog. So those things are just not mappable. The things that are mappable are probably campaign length. Like if I was going to get an IP, and let me give an example. If we had a game that had like a lengthy story, right? Maybe our board game would have chapters that you can go through a similar, and we could mirror it. As opposed to, this game is 1 hour long, The game length is just dictated by the fact that, but the content does not have that can be mapped to the IP.
All right, and I guess now this is something I think is probably more in line with like the Kickstarter projects. But do you think about like the tabletop games in terms of stretch goals and expansions when it comes to like these licensed game projects?
Oh, totally. They might have a say depending on the goal of the license holder, and if they hired us to make a game or they had a pre-existing system. So it's just this following is not exactly. It's extremely dependent. However, if I had control of it, I would 100% be considering stretch goals and expandability of the game. We spend a lot of time making a system. If it's successful, do we want just one product and have another 1 year dev cycle before we can come up with another? Not really. You want a game system that's expandable, that can be built on. So if you love it, we can add more content to it and complete it out. Now, that being said, with stretch goals, we're not trying to, and unfortunately, we're not trying to give you but we do make a game that is safe, worth the MSRP and whatnot. If you go over and we are guaranteed a larger production run, we can afford better margins, extra, no problem. That's to us the best way. Everyone wins. You want more stuff for P? Yes. And this is also a huge reason mini games kill it. They get so bloated with stretch goals that even if the game is unplayable, they're getting a bunch of minis for crazy prices for right? So think of it that way. Make it a must buy because there's no way retail would be. The fact that to ship a heavy game gates that. Kickstarters literally only that's also not true.
Yeah, and like we mentioned earlier, like that Kingdom Oblivion game or whatever it was called, that like earned so much money. Like some of those figurines or some of those miniatures and such are just incredible to look at.
Yeah, you might just want them. Period. Regardless if you play or not, people definitely buy board games just for the like.
Yeah,
even if they don't play.
Yeah. So. Like with St. Peterson's Cthulhu Wars, I was tempted to see if I could get a copy of that just so I can have like that giant Cthulhu figurine I could just use or just put it on my stream for any reason whatsoever.
Yeah, it's just rad, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, the physicality of it is unique.
Definitely. So I guess speaking about the physicality, there's one thing that I like to ask like tabletop developers specifically about. And that again goes back to something like Tabletop Simulator and this idea of almost like going full circle, taking a digital game, translating it to tabletop, and then taking that tabletop and then translating it back to digital in a way. And I just want to ask you, like, what are your thoughts on kind of like the idea of simulating tabletop games using, Tabletop Simulator or just making a digital version of your tabletop game?
Tabletop Simulator and a digital version of like two different. Like, in order for me to enjoy tabletop, I need to understand the game already, want to play it, and then also understand the interface. Tabletop Simulator. It's a huge amount of front-loaded stuff, but that's awesome. So people might enjoy it. They can play it. They can have a good time. It's extremely different than just getting my game, learning it already in an analog way, and just it's significant. And because of that, it's also not physical. Have a big deal. People release their games completely on Tabletop Simulator before the game ships. I do because it's just not good enough. You can go in there and enjoy the game, and if you like it, for real, right? The physicality and the gate that the digital version presents, gates that the extra complexity presents to play is significant. We use Tabletop Simulator all the time, so that way we can make quick iterations, play them, but we can't test the user experience. We can only test. If I was going to make a digital version of my game, I have different experience. I expect logic of the game to do the boring parts. Why do I need a deck to flip a card to like a random effect? I have to make this. But Tabletop Simulator, it's a thing. It is super niche. You'll hear about it a lot because they're vocal. You should put it out there to get those vocal and understand it. Don't feel bad about giving away your game. You're not. A lot of people, they say, hey, you want to play this on Tabletop Simulator? They already love it.
Yep. And that's again how my friends got me to playing in the first place. They already knew those games, and it was very important because they were the ones who had to explain to me what the heck was going on.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So they helped you with the front load. Are you going to boot Tabletop Sim and just be like, yeah, let me try this out, read this rule book? That's not going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
But it is a wonderful tool. It is not a threat to either space, physical.
Right. So I think with that, let's begin to wrap things up, because we could certainly segue into talking more about onboarding and playability, but that is a massive topic. Maybe we can somehow get like John in for that conversation, because I think the three of us could just talk at length about that.
Oh, yeah, that'd be fantastic.
So I guess with that, any final thoughts, anything you would like to say about the topic, or just anything to like kind of wrap the cast up on?
I would say when you're focusing on translating other systems into another, it's always about feedback. That's the number one thing. It's not going to be perfect. You can make it. That's the number one takeaway.
And I guess, do you have anything you'd like to say to your fans listening right now as well?
Well, yeah, Pocket Paragons is coming out October 6th. So if you like my games, or if you want to play some sick IP crossover battles, please check it out. We're super happy with the reviews are coming in, people. I'm really
great. So I think with that, we'll wrap things up here. In terms of social media-wise, for people to find and follow you, if you have any place you would like me to list or for them to look up, feel free to mention them.
Yeah, you can find Solis Game Studio on Facebook and Twitter. We're equally active on both. And it's the best place to follow us for sure.
All right, and people want to follow you on Twitter. Do you have a social account you'd like to give them?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. It's CGC Fox. I'll send you a link in there.
Okay.
Follow me. I talk about game design, board games, and video games all the time.
Awesome. So, with that said, I believe we will begin to wrap things up for tonight. So, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you tonight, Chris. And yeah, again, like this is a topic that it's fascinating to hear, like from my perspective, because I didn't get a chance to really experience it around here, and it is such a healthy and very diverse market in terms of properties and design.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad that I can provide some insightful information.
Awesome. So, for those of you listening to this right now, we're going to end things for our cast. Be sure to check out the links and such. They should be in the description of this video or on the cast on Game Wisdom. If you'd like to follow me, I am on Twitter at GWBycer. Those should be links to our Discord as well as our Patreon as well in the description. Be sure to join our Discord if you'd like to hang out and talk game design topics. And if you are a developer working in the industry, have an upcoming game, or just want to chat game design with me, and if you're interested in coming on for a cast, please get in touch. Otherwise, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, thanks for listening. Take care.